Lauren, over to you.
Okay, great. Let me just stop sharing so long. Okay, welcome everybody this afternoon to this afternoon's webinar, our SaferSpaces usual Friday webinar. My name is Lauren October and I'll be the moderator today. So this webinar is one in a series of webinars that SaferSpaces is hosting with topics that explore key elements of the white paper on safety and security. Today's webinar will be focusing on interventions to upgrade aspects of informal settlements and how this can improve safety and security for residents. Our speakers today have all prepared presentations in this regard, so let me just introduce them. First up, we have Mercy Brown-Luthango with the African Centre for Cities at UCT. Research is focused around the creation of sustainable human settlements. Then we have Sabina Favaro with the Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading NPC, where she leads a team of designers focusing on safe and inclusive spaces and social justice. And then finally, we have a presentation by Hayley Gewer, a member of the Sticky Situations team, and she will be presenting a case study on their work on N Street, North Park. After the speakers have concluded, we'll open up for a question and answer session. Just please note that this session is being recorded and that the video will later be uploaded on the past events section of the SaferSpaces website. But I'm not going to waste too much time because we have 3 speakers, so I think we'll just go straight into it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mercy.
Thank you, Lauren. Shall I share my screen? Or?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Mercy Brown-Luthango. I'm a researcher with the African Centre for Cities at UCT. Today, I'll be speaking about research looking at the relationship between upgrading of informal settlements and residents' experience and perceptions of safety after this upgrading intervention. This research was done a couple of years ago in 4 informal settlements that have all undergone some form of upgrading intervention. So just in terms of the structure of my presentation, I will give a bit of an contextual overview just to frame some of the research findings around the relationship between increased urbanization, growing informality and violence in cities in the Global South. And we'll then talk a little bit about upgrading as a tool to improve safety, and then go into some of the findings from our research, and then conclude with some thoughts about upgrading of informal settlements as a safety tool, and reflecting on some of what the white paper on safety and security says around this issue. So, as you may all know, urbanization is increasing at a very fast pace in the developing world specifically. And by 2050, it's estimated that the world's urban population will grow to 6.25 billion, and 5.1 billion of this will be in cities in the developing world. Africa in particular has experienced the highest urban growth during the last 2 decades. At 3.5%, and this rate of growth is expected to continue into 2050. So this is evidenced by the fact that over 100 of the fastest growing cities in the world are in Africa. South Africa is no exception and has one of the highest urbanization rates at 66% in Africa. This urban growth, however, is a very particular kind of urban growth, as it is accompanied by the growth in informal settlements or in informality. The number of urban population in urban informal settlements in African cities has decreased between 2005 and 2014, but it is still close to 50%. And there are 238 million urban dwellers in sub-Saharan Africa who live in informal settlements. So as you can see, there's a close relationship between growth in informality and urbanization in cities in the global south, particularly in Africa. So cities also experience high levels of violence as this rate of urbanization is increasing. And it is argued by UN Habitat that crime and violence are typically more severe in urban areas and are compounded by their rapid growth. So it's not necessarily urbanization in and of itself that is linked to increased violence, but it's rather the rate or the pace, the speed at which urbanization is happening in Africa and in cities in Asia in particular. So it is what this fast rate of urbanization is what Robert Maga calls turbo-urbanism, and it's linked to increasing fragility in these cities. So really this fast-paced urbanization puts a strain of local governments on its resources and capacities as it fails to respond fast enough in terms of the delivery of services and infrastructure to keep pace with this growing population of urban residents. This leads to very poor living environments for a great majority of urban residents. And it's exactly this physical attribute of poor living environments which create opportunities for violence and heightened frustration and a sense of exclusion. This contributes to violence. So for example, a lack of lighting in informal settlements, narrow alleyways, and sanitation facilities, for example, being located often on the periphery of informal settlements that create opportunities for violence to occur when women, for example, try to access sanitation facilities that are far from their dwellings. So it's not that urban or people living in informal settlements are more prone to violence or crime, but it's rather that you find in informal settlements a concentration and of all the risk factors, or many of the risk factors for urban violence, which is poverty, different forms of inequality, spatial inequality, income inequality, unemployment, poor quality of built environment, also a large youth population, which, as you know, young people are more at risk in terms of being victims and perpetrators of violence. So all these risk factors then are concentrated in informal settlements, which create ideal conditions for violence to occur. So although the relationship between urbanization, spatial inequality, exclusion, and violence is not that well researched or understood in cities of the global south, a lot of the literature is still focused on experience of or context in the north. Work done by UN Habitat, for example, show that informal settlements are more vulnerable to crime and violence, and therefore violence prevention and improving the safety and security of informal settlement dwellers should be one of the most important priorities of interventions to upgrade urban environments, and it shouldn't be like an incidental consequence of upgrading projects. Yet you find a still siloed kind of approach to upgrading of informal settlements, where it's often seen as a housing solution or a human settlements issue, and violence is seen as a policing issue or not the domain of planners or people working to improve living environments. And it's exactly this kind of siloed approach to dealing with or improving safety in informal settlements that we need to work against. So in cases where improvements in safety, for example, have been observed as part of an upgrading intervention, and this has often been an unexpected outcome. And yet in South Africa, for example, Chapter 13 of the Breaking New Ground Human Settlements Policy speak clearly to safety as an outcome of informal settlement upgrading, and yet there's often very little focused attention on improving safety in upgrading interventions. So about the research that we conducted, it was done a couple of years ago, but I think that some of the findings are still relevant today. So we looked at informal settlements that had undergone some sort of upgrading intervention in the last 10 years. We looked at different kinds of upgrading interventions. So in Freedom Park in Mitchell's Plain, for example, we looked at a full upgrading, meaning going from informal settlement without basic services to a full housing solution where people were provided with houses, infrastructure, services, and so forth. The second project we looked at is in Sheffield Road in Philippi, which was a reblocking project that was implemented by CORG, the Informal Settlements Network, and in Ikayalami in partnership with the City of Cape Town. And they saw the reconfiguration of the site where the dwellings were broken down and then rebuilt with fire-resistant materials, and the dwellings were built in the form of a cluster formation so that people could, for example, have eyes on each other's dwellings. And then we looked at Monwabisi Park in Khayelitsha, which is a VPU project, which saw a set of different projects, including improvement of public spaces, provision of basic services, tenure certificates, and other social services. And these projects were sort of different sizes. Freedom Park, for example, there were 493 households. Sheffield Road was a bit smaller, only 140 households were included in the upgrading intervention. And then obviously Monwabisi Park is quite a huge settlement. In terms of the tools, research tools that we used, we conducted in-depth interviews with a number of residents, also government officials, the police, neighborhood watchers, if there was a neighborhood watch, also social workers, to get a wide as possible array of perspectives on whether there was any impact in terms of safety after the upgrading intervention, whether there was improvement in people's perceptions of their quality of life, of the experiences of violence and perceptions of violence. We also conducted focus group discussions and community crime mapping, where we engaged some members of the community in mapping of crime hotspots in the settlements before and after the upgrading intervention. So just in terms of findings in Freedom Park, we found mixed reactions in terms of people's perceptions of their quality of life. So people felt very sure and were very happy about the impact of the provision of water, electricity and sanitation. They felt that, you know, we have running water, electricity, flush toilets, our dignity has been restored. We can invite people, we live in houses and not walkies anymore. So there was a different perception that life was better because of the provision of basic services, not just physically, but also in terms of people's feelings of dignity and inclusion. But on the other hand, people also felt that this house, which they had been waiting for so long, actually made them feel poorer. They now had to pay for services like electricity, like water, which they didn't have to do before. And in the context of high unemployment, huge reliance of social grants, people felt that this house had made an imposition on their lives in terms of actually making them feel poorer. The other important finding from this research that people actually felt that this housing intervention had impacted negatively on neighbourineness and their sense of social cohesion. Whereas before, when they lived informally, they had community strategies in place to deal with violence, to, for example, a neighborhood watch. They had a marshal system where certain people were elected by the community to enforce, in a way, rules around violence and crime and so forth. And all these structures disappeared when these houses were built. So people felt like we stood with each other, but the community changed and friendships fell. Community friendliness has changed for worse. We live together like a family. Now there's no unity. Just in terms of safety, like I said, we did a community mapping exercise, and the map on your left-hand side basically shows the situation before upgrading, and the one on the right after upgrading. As you can see, there was an increase in the incidence of violence and crime, specifically in and around a 50-meter radius of shebeens. After upgrading, there were very few shebeens reported before the upgrading intervention. And this was also linked to this increasing financial insecurity that people experienced with getting this house. Safety, this was also interesting in that, you know, people experience different or relate different experiences of safety. So in some instances, again, when referring to their house, the physical structure, they felt safe on the one hand because they had walls now, and there was this idea that, you know, bullets can't go through walls. But on the other hand, because of the structure, the physical quality of the housing that was provided was so bad, people felt like this house can collapse on top of me at any moment. People didn't feel safe in the neighborhood, as many reported feeling unsafe in the broader neighborhood. In Sheffield Road, interestingly, this was the Reblocking project. People felt that there was an improvement in their living conditions, although there was some disappointment expressed because of, at the time when we did the research, there was still no electricity provided to this informal settlement. but they felt like the new materials, the fire-resistant materials, had actually created or contributed to feelings of safety. Also, they felt more safe with regards to general feelings of safety and experiences of violence. Interestingly, unlike in Freedom Park, where there was a feeling of a loss of community cohesion and neighbourliness, in Sheffield Road, respondents actually reported feeling more, that there was a feeling of more neighbourliness, more social cohesion, people looking out for each other. And this was facilitated by this, the new structure and the way in which the dwellings were configured in a cluster formation, so that people could see their neighbors, they could see their houses. When someone went to work, for example, they could keep an eye on their house when people were at work. So this all contributed to more social cohesion. So people reported that we are safe because people watch each other's houses, and now we know each other. In Monwabisi Park, also people felt that there was an improvement after the upgrading and all the services and infrastructure improvements that came with the VPU intervention in Monwabisi Park. So in fact, when you look at this, sort of gives you an idea, this diagram of how people felt. Before, they felt it was bad. Afterwards, after the projects, they felt there was an improvement, particularly in relation to the provision of electricity, water, and safe places for children to play. At the time when we did the research, people were still waiting for improved sanitation, more toilets. So this was a big sort of source of unhappiness at the time. But obviously this was a while ago, so I think the sanitation situation has improved in Monwabisi Park since we did the research. Just in terms of perceptions of safety, people definitely felt safer because of electricity, lighting, and they felt that Monwabisi Park is better than before. 60% of the people we interviewed felt safer. But again, the issue of sanitation, especially because at the time, children also had to still use the bushes as a sanitation solution, and people felt at risk because of that. There was also concern about the police response, which was considered to be bad because police took too long to get to the area, or they did not arrive at all. In terms of community responses to crime and violence, there was patrolling, community patrolling, but it was also felt that in the event of crime, 1 out of 3 of respondents would do nothing. And there was also the sense that patrolling was linked to vigilantism and that patrollers were not safe. In conclusion, just some thoughts. So the white paper on safety and security speaks clearly to the multidimensional nature of violence and the need for a holistic approach to respond to violence. So some of the important interventions identified in the white paper, for example, effective and integrated service delivery, appropriate built environment interventions, and the need for good urban design to improve safety, active and public community participation, and the importance of social cohesion. These are all supported by the research findings that I've just discussed. But as we know that it's often I mean, we don't have a lack of good policy in South Africa. We do have very good policies, but it's often in the implementation where we fall short for a range of different reasons. So as we saw in this research, the provision of basic services, water, electricity, sanitation, has a huge impact, both in terms of physical improvement of people's living conditions, as well as the psychological aspects related to feelings of dignity and recognition. And this was a consistent finding across the 3 projects, whether it was in Freedom Park or in the Reblocking project in Sheffield Road or in Monmapisi Park. This was a consistent finding. So basic services, the provision of basic services does make a huge impact in people's quality or the perception of their quality of life. But whilst improvements in the built environment are essential, without a change in broader structural conditions, the impacts of interventions like upgrading will be minimal and unsustainable in the long run. As we saw in Freedom Park, for example, because of a lack of employment, people felt that the house that they had been looking forward to for so long actually made them poorer because they couldn't afford to pay for the services, and that had other sort of knock-on effects in terms of alternative livelihood strategies, which then also contributed to violence and crime. And in some instances, these upgrading interventions do have unintentional consequences, like a loss of community cohesion, like we saw in Freedom Park, and like I said, making people feel poorer. So in Freedom Park, there's this provision of a house elicits mixed emotions. On the one hand, it provides sheltered protection from violence outside the home, yet there is this disappointment with the structural quality of the house. And this basically just shows how the notion of safety is multi-layered. It relates to people's feelings and perceptions of safety in the house, the structure of the house, the quality of the house, and also the broader neighborhood and some of the infrastructure and services provided in the broader neighborhood, the surrounding community. And upgrading intervention need to take cognizance of this complexity and the multi-layered nature of safety. Also, much more consideration should be given to exactly what constitutes sustainable human settlements and how to create environments in which people are safe. So still, despite this shift from housing to the Department of Human Settlements, there's still too much focus on the provision of this physical infrastructure and not enough on looking at broader community facilities, safe spaces, safe infrastructure and services, which all contribute to the sustainable human settlements. Also, it's important to look at social networks and community cohesion within settlements, and upgrading interventions should find ways to support and enhance these. And the provision of shelter should be a component of a much wider strategy to eradicate poverty and inequality by addressing these broader structural conditions like unemployment, substance abuse, interpersonal and community-based violence, which will all impact on the longer-term sustainability of these interventions. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Mercy. That was a very interesting presentation, and as you said, still very relevant to this day. It was interesting for me as well to see the contrasting results and all the unintended consequences, but also it helps you think about, how communities should be designed and what communities think contributes to social cohesion and safety. But I could go on and on, so I'm going to move on to the next speaker before I talk too much. Sabina, over to you.
Thank you. Let's share. Okay, this is
Is it sharing? Don't know if it is.
Not yet.
No. Is it sharing or not?
No.
Okay, he's asking me to try again. Let me see if I can try another way. Hold on. Yeah. Don't know why.
It was working earlier. It always happens like that. Works earlier and then when you try
Exactly.
again, it stops.
Yeah, I think we're all familiar with this situation since COVID has kick-started. The unintended. I hope it will go this way. Maybe I can start by saying that the presentation is looking a little bit at the notion of violence and then diving into the VPU methodology or the VPU approach and looking then in more detail about safety promotion, if I can get to open it. Where is it gone? This is very funny. And not funny, sorry for a waste of time. Try again, Sabina, try again, okay. No, can you see it? No, it's not gone.
No.
Oh, you can see me.
Yeah, I can see you now.
It's gone very funny. Don't know why it's asking me. Okay. Okay, and what about now?
Ooh,
can you see?
There we go. Yes.
Okay, I have to change mean of communication. It wasn't like in PowerPoint. Wow. Is it working now? I cannot hear anybody anymore.
Oh, it's black, but it's sharing your screen, but it's on a black screen. I don't know if it is your presentation or not.
No, it's not black. It's violence about violence, but it's not. Okay. Okay, I think now it's working. There we go. Can you see it?
No, it's still black. I don't know if anybody else is also seeing black.
I can
are you
see
sharing the
screen, but
I think when you made it screen size, it lost its image.
I don't know why it's doing that. And if I do it like that, can you see
it?
There
we go. Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, let's keep it here.
It's fine. It's working. Fine.
I wanted to start a little to talk about violence. I mean, we are aware that South Africa is one of the most violent country and has one also the most unequal country, which has not seemed to be a coincidence. I think Mercy already highlighted that the low-income area and informal settlement in particular are affected by violence, and number of murder per 10,000 people are quite high in South Africa, and particularly in Cape Town, and particularly in certain areas, starting from Nyaga and Khayelitsha, and within informal settlements. And yeah, there is this target that the national target that all people in South Africa should are and feel safe. That's what the NDP, we are all aspiring to that. Also, just to maybe take a note that there's three different types of violence. There's the direct one, which is visible, the interpersonal violence, emotional violence, etc., which we are experiencing on an everyday basis. But there is also structural and cultural violence, which is invisible. That's what Galton say, but I will argue that in South Africa it is quite visible if we look at spatial injustice. Structural violence, it is a bit visible, quite visible, because the impact of apartheid and the spatial injustices, it's really still quite evident. So, and if we look at the triangle of violence, the victim, offender, and place, these are the three key important player. Place, the notion of space plays a role. So the emphasis that I wanted to bring forward today is around the role of space and the role of us as designer, and everybody I'm assuming everybody in the room play a role in addressing violence. And the question is, what role does space play? Yeah, and it's important to get an understanding that goes deeper in terms of how does violence take place. And then we know there is all this technique about crime hotspots, crime mapping, crime hotspots, crime route, crime areas. And it is essential to go and get an understanding from the ground, because yeah, if you have to do any kind of intervention, you need to understand where is it taking place, what kind of crime hotspot is it? Is it a generator? Is it an attractor? Is it an enabler? Yeah, and then there is the white paper, and the white paper, I think Mercy also highlighted, is taking a very kind of broad, holistic stance and looking at in all direction, which I think it's heading in the right direction, and it's important that all these 6 themes works together in addressing violence. So VPU, as you probably know, focus on improving people's quality of life and co-producing through basically co-producing safe and sustainable neighborhood. So the idea is to, let's say that the motivation behind the strategy, that is basically the strategy is trying to look at 3 critical aspects. One is violence, is addressing the 3 different types of violence. And the other one is looking at the apartheid legacy, the institutional one, which is still present, the social one, and the spatial one again, spatial injustice. And also looking at sustainability. So how do we promote socioeconomic development, but also be mindful of the environment? And the approach that is an area-based approach, which is people-centered, there's evidence-based through various survey, participatory mapping, qualitative interview, and it's really context-specific, it's addressing the context, and it's trying to be multi-sectorial, involving everyone from local authorities to actors and community members, and it's trying to foster partnership. So, and also it's really important to look at all the various level of society, because when in addressing violence, you need to look at all the risk factors that are at play at individual, relational, and community and societal level. So yeah, what are the risk factors at play, and what are the protective factors that needs to be targeted? In a similar way, again, space plays a role within the triangle of violence. So it's also important to understand and unpack what are the different social spatial conditions, like what is the role that space is playing within a crime hotspot, for instance, or within a neighborhood. How does it? What are the constraints? What are the opportunities? For instance, in a neighborhood like Mannenberg and Hanover Park, you can really see there are clear invisible walls. The way that the neighborhood is structured, it has a lack of continuity of movement, and there is a clear relation between the gang territory and the way that the neighborhood is structured. So the thing is that we need to listen to people and listen to space. This is kind of the stance that I wanted to discuss with you today. On one hand, we need to address the social needs, the local needs of the people, and staying within the environmental ceiling. But yeah, this is, in the way we kind of doing it at VPU is taking the stance of using the VPU strategy, which is basically, it's got 4 main layers. It looks at prevention, cohesion, protection, and evidence. So the lifelong learning, there's various programs. So there's early childhood development, youth development, and looking at how do we foster income generating opportunity and economic development. And then there is the whole second layer, the cohesion layer, which looks at community mobilization, the delivery of service and urban management. And then there is the third level, which is looking at CoDesign and spatial planning and urban design. And then and public safety and access to justice. And the last quarter looks at evidence, and it's really program planning, management, monitoring, evaluation, and information sharing and research and capacity building. So the whole VPU matrix is aligned to the SDG, and it's basically the main link is with the sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11. But I also think that there is a clear alignment with the white paper. And last year we were part of, I'm sure many of you knows, we were part of this knowledge exchange because VPU has been one of the longest violence crime prevention intervention in South Africa. And there are clear link between there's a clear alignment between the white paper and the strategy. Even though the strategy, I feel like it covers all the 6 themes, VPU is not active in all of them, but we do a lot of community participation. We do early ACD, early intervention, and we are heavily involved in trying to bring effective and integrated service delivery, focusing on safety, security, and violence, and addressing crime. And also there is that strong component of safety through environmental design, which is kind of the main focus of today. So yeah, you are probably familiar with Harare, the urban precinct. So it went from here, where there were a lot of direct structural violence and cultural violence, they're all at play, and moved from here to here. Not to say that the violence is completely resolved. Obviously, it's still at play, and it's also quite difficult to measure violence, but there is certainly an improvement, and the transformation that has been made was through negotiation. It's really negotiated development, fostering partnership. These facilities are used on a daily basis. There are programs running. People feel proud of them, and so quality of life. I just wanted to briefly say that the quality of life, it covers, when we look at quality of life in house, just to give you a glimpse, from an urban design perspective, we look at all these aspects. So safety and security, social and ecologically active landscape. What does the landscape look like? Is it active? Is it socially active? Is it used? Is it ecologically active? Our neighborhoods are connected and accessible or not? Is there access to basic services or not? And how is the lifelong learning? Are the learning aspect, the learning spaces, are they functioning? There's enough learning spaces, an innovative and attractive space economy. In order to address the past legacy of apartheid, where there are basically dormitory suburbs, it's important to foster economic development, and then looking at the quality of the public space and celebrating cultural narratives. And all of this together with inclusive participation and governance. So this is kind of like an image that summarizes a bit what are the aspects that we look when we look at development strategies. Today, the focus obviously is on safety and security, but I wanted to bring this aspect to the fore because you can't really address safety and security even through the CPTED principle if you don't look at all of these other aspects and if you don't look at multiple scales and a different level. So sorry, maybe I'm taking too long. So in a nutshell, when in doing development strategy that focus also on crime prevention, we are looking at identifying risk and protective factor that will basically determine future soft and targeted programs, and looking at the various scales and identifying what are the constraints and opportunities, what are the spatial project. So the soft project and the spatial project together basically forms a development strategy at various scale. In order to do so, you need an inclusive and participatory process. One cannot do any of this on your own. You have to involve everyone through the mapping and to map the issues and to get a better understanding, but also to co-design a shared vision that is then owned and becomes more concrete into a strategy, which is a safe community action plan, and then it gets implemented and in the long term can improve the quality of life. It has an impact on quality of life. So yeah, I wanted to just very briefly take you through this urban design imperative that mostly focus on safety. But again, you need to look at it within the other 6. You can't just look at safety through environmental design without looking at the other aspects. Sorry. So there are, I think, 8 urban design imperatives that focus on safety that we make use in developing strategy. The first one is inclusive design and co-design. So it's basically ensuring that we are involving each and every one so that the participatory processes are inclusive, but also that whatever gets designed is also for all people of all ages and of all abilities, so that there is that all vulnerable people are included, that is GNSI savvy, and what else? And then they seem very critical that there is a lot of information sharing, that all stakeholders are included, that the communication and the dialogue between the very relevant stakeholders is flowing. So the other safety principle is owned spaces, and this is done through the co-developing spatial plans that are basically drawing from these inclusive participatory processes, and that the vision of there is a shared vision by all stakeholders, and then gets implemented through various projects where the community is involved from the design to the maintenance, so that these spaces become owned and that maintained by the community. Again, surveillance and visibility is another important aspect. We need to make sure that the streets that there is activation on the streets, that there is active frontages, that there is a clear visibility of and legibility of spaces, that there are like effective lighting during the night, and that the space is clear and visible, and there is a passive surveillance. As you can see, some of these are more focusing on safety through the safety through environmental design, but others also touches on other aspects of the white paper. Then define access and safe movement can be achieved through legibility of spaces, through landmarks, clear signage, and hierarchy of movement, visibility, passive surveillance, but also trying to understand, trying to identify which one are the missing link, how do we improve the continuity of the movement network, and to prioritize non-motorized movement and make sure that that freedom of movement happen in a safer manner. And then physical barrier, it's basically looking at having a clear gradient between private to public, but maintaining that transparency so that you have positive edges, but also fences that are the see-through, where you can, and the spaces that shows the transition clearly. Then images and aesthetics, it's about the human scale, the use of appropriate material, the durability, the landscaping, adequate lighting, co-design, in order to harvest like cultural narrative and including public art, and possibly done by local artists to celebrate the cultural narrative, and designing high level of activities. And operation and maintenance, yeah, it's about involving community in the maintenance of spaces. It's also about having a plan from the start, about making sure that there is a dedicated budget for maintenance, that there is a plan for maintenance, and communities involved. And also in terms of integration of development, it's important that the spaces are designed so in such a way and integrated in such a way that there is income generation within a precinct, for instance, so that can feed the maintenance of spaces. As you can see, this touches in multiple of the white paper themes. And lastly is the activation of space, which I think is one of the most important, is to make sure that throughout the design process, be it a precinct, or be it a neighborhood, or be it an informal settlement, there is there is a mapping of the existing activation, what's happening, where are the informal traders, where the gardenings, where the learning and recreational spaces and social activities, what's missing in the community. There is that other mapping to be done, and then moving towards what can come next, what's the future vision for the area, is kind of understanding what kind of development partnership needs to be established to address the missing activities. And this is the most critical part, because and it's a critical aspect, because often if you have public spaces and they're not properly activated, they can easily become crime hotspot. And particularly, I think, as Mercy also said earlier, it's more difficult to maintain the public open spaces, or they can get, if I understood correctly what you were saying, even in the informal settlements, the public open space, people appreciate mostly the basic service, and the public open space is easier, more difficult to maintain it unless there is a proper activation. Okay, to end, I've got just a few slides that shows some of the recent development in Lotus Park. So in Lotus Park, the incremental approach the VPU took in terms of upgrading the public open spaces, along with the monitoring and of taps and toilet and the certificates that gets distributed at the CIO. There was the Neighbourhood Centre that started in 2013-14, and from there the Precinct is growing, and now there is a waste station that has just got built, and a business incubator and ECD resource centre. Yeah, some picture, and there is a waste station, and there is a food garden, and there's a business incubator that is coming. And these are some images on the M2 journey. I think I'm going to stop it here because I've spoken too much already. Sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sabina. Let me just hand straight over to Hayley in ways to save time. Hayley?
Ooh. Thanks so much, Lauren. I was trying to open my video, but I can't seem to do that. So I'm just going to talk from behind my picture. So thanks very much. Thanks, Mercy. Thanks, Sabina. I actually think that my presentation is going to follow really nicely from Sabina's. And I am going to try and move through it quite quickly because I realize it's late. And yeah. So I want to talk, and in fact, there's a lot of similarities between what I'm going to talk about and what Sabina was talking about, is about co-production and community capacity building that helps to promote safer parks and public spaces. And I'm going to use an example of a case study that we've worked on in N Street North in Hillbrow to illustrate this. So just quickly, we all know that safe, inclusive, accessible and functional, sustainable parks and public spaces are important to all neighborhoods. When they are well managed and maintained, they can promote sociability, cohesion and well-being, but they can also become spaces that reflect and harness broader social ills. The Joburg City Parks and Zoos, facing large limited budgets, capacity building and budgets and resources, as well as the task of developing and managing over 3,000 parks around the city, realized that the improvement and ongoing safety and maintenance of parks around the city cannot continue to be a top-down process, and it can't simply be a simple service delivery process, nor can it undertake the work alone. It's now, the Joburg City Parks and Zoo is now realizing that for parks and public open spaces to be looked after and kept safe and clean, everyday users of the space need to be included in its development and management. So we were contracted by Joburg City Parks and Zoos to oversee the co-production process of redeveloping N Street North. And when I say we, I'm talking about sticky situations. So we are a community engagement participatory organization that uses participatory design methods to facilitate, coordinate, and implement community-driven processes. We work across Johannesburg. We work in the inner city of Johannesburg and in informal settlements outside of, on the periphery of Johannesburg, working through a range of development initiatives, whether it's about parks and public space upgrades, sanitation in informal settlements. So we do a range of work for those of you who don't know about us. So the case study I'm going to use is about N Street North. It was a collaborative process between Joburg City Parks and Zoos, the Joburg Development Agency, and the Department of Public Safety, together with Sticky Situations. The project had 3 key goals: to test and demonstrate. It was a pilot project initially, to test and demonstrate a community-based approach to park development and management using co-production community engagement methodologies, to develop an approach where government departments and officials collaborate more effectively around public spaces and parks, and to work towards bridging the divide between citizens and the city. So trying to get city officials out of their offices into parks and public spaces to really communicate with everyday users of the space, to really understand the challenges around safety, around accessibility, and to begin to have a more holistic understanding of the challenges that users face in these public spaces. So N Street North is located between Doornfontein and Hillbrow. It was a pilot project, and the project aimed to develop a kind of a good governance model for integrated urban development that involved a collaborative process between city officials and everyday residents. And hopefully that the model could then be scaled up and replicated in other parts of the city or even in South Africa. So what we found when we came to N Street North initially was a park mainly used by lots of young men, lots of single young men in the park. The reclaimers occupied different areas of the park for sorting out bottles and tins. There were a lot of homeless people living in the park. There was a lot of substance users. There was a lot of people injecting nyope, and some older school children from the school next door sitting and gambling around the park. There was a climate of animosity, fear, distrust, and distress. And when we spoke to the residents around, so just to go back, around the park itself are a lot of buildings and residential buildings. Most of the users didn't use the park. They didn't like their children going there, and they had they had a lot of animosity towards the homeless and the reclaimers in the park. So what did we do? We started off by going around to all the buildings and just knocking on doors, introducing ourselves, talking to residents, talking to the businesses around the area, talking to the traders, talking to the homeless people, talking to the reclaimers, talking to everybody who was involved with the space to develop a holistic sense and to really kind of understand what the key challenges are. We brought everybody into the park on a number of occasions and held discussions with all park users, including the homeless, including the substance users, including the reclaimers, including the businesses. And then we developed programs. So I forgot to say this project started in 2016 and it ran for 3 or 4 years. So it was a very long project. Every Saturday or every second Saturday afternoon, we got into the park and we developed a series of programs to bring people back into the park, to make the park more active, to give people an idea of what could actually happen in the park, and also to give them an understanding that the park was a safe space. It was generally through discussions, a lot of the animosity was towards the homeless people and the reclaimers and the drug users. But actually what emerged from a lot of the conversations is that these people were actually the eyes and ears of the park. And these were not the people who were committing crimes, but were actually being aware of what the dynamics around the park were. So I'm just going to run through a couple of slides just to show you what we did. We did ongoing engagements. I'm just running through, we used Minecraft to get people imagining how the park could be in the redevelopment process. We did boxing, aerobics, art, dancing, bouncing castles, reading groups, a lot of discussions, talking to people. We did a lot of safety mapping. We spoke to the school next door and spoke to how it could, the children, how they could imagine the park. We had a lot of meet your neighbor events. We got people together to write rules of the park, to think about governance structures. We had afternoons where HIV testing came, Know Your Rights came, emergency service came, and spoke to people about the facilities that could happen in the park, how the park could be used. So there was a lot of engagement around what could happen in this park once the park was redeveloped together with the JDA. So what we learned, there was a lot of learning that came out of it, that parks are not simply spaces of play and relaxation, but they're critical spaces that could encourage active citizenship and self-actualization. That they're essential spaces that contribute to the physical and well-being of neighborhoods. And particularly in African cities, parks are not simply spaces of play, but they're spaces of transaction and socialization. Importantly, parks don't exist in isolation. They're a part of the social fabric of neighborhoods, and all the social conditions that manifest in a broader neighborhood will also manifest in a local park. And that we need to start seeing parks, not in the traditional sense, but start seeing parks in a very, a more dynamic and fluid way to the traditional understandings of parks. And that safety is not simply about crime, that it's multifaceted, it permeates every aspect of society, and that we need to understand safety in a very different way. That local communities are resources and not burdens, and that the activism of local communities are often able to unlock processes and potentials better than the city can. And the last point, number 9, I think is the most important, that the city needs to identify local champions that can help mediate park development and management processes. So there was a lot of initial learning processes as we went along the program. The most important thing is what happened along the way. So it's common that once invested stakeholders are engaged in development and in participation and dialogue, other critical issues emerged. And the most critical issues was that through talking to residents and businesses, it emerged that people were getting knocked down. The reason why the park wasn't used is that people were getting knocked down crossing Nugget Street, which is a very busy street in Hillbrow. And that despite ongoing requests to Joburg Roads Agency to put in speed humps or robots, their requests had fallen on deaf ears, and it had been years since they had requested that. And also the need for toilets. And the JDA didn't want to develop toilets or build toilets in the parks because they thought that it would make the parks unsafe and they would be difficult to manage. But from talking with residents, these emerged as key needs that park users would need. And also key. And so what we did in terms of the toilets is that we walked around, we mapped all the public toilets within the inner city of Johannesburg. And there were so few toilets, and that lent weight to the need to install toilets. Eventually, the local residents protested. They blocked Nugget Street until the city eventually agreed to bring JRA in and install speed bumps so that people could access the parks more safely. And only actually 2 months ago, the toilets got completed in the park. These are the images of the toilets. It was a real struggle to win over JDA, to get them to understand that part of the co-production process, part of the co-management process was the essentialness of having toilets in the park for park users. So the parks were open, local artists got involved in doing the designing and the artwork. And 2 months ago, the launch of the toilets happened. Another thing that happened was the training of what we call park activation coordinators. So Joburg City Parks and Zoos identified local champions, local activists that were living close to the inner city parks, and financed a program of mentoring these PACs, which Sticky Situations was involved in. And till today, these PAC, park activation coordinators, are champions of their local parks. So they're involved with the parks, they're involved with the maintenance of the parks and ensuring safety within the parks. So here's just some images of the training program. That's Jen, one of my colleagues from Sticky Situations. The park activation coordinators, you can see there, we designed the program. We did the mentoring program with them together with Joburg City Parks and Zoos. Some more pictures. That's us in different parks, speaking to people about local challenges. And this is N Street North today. So I'll just show you, if I can just quickly go back to how the park looked initially. Sorry, I'm just running through all these slides. So that's how N Street North looked when we came there. And this is what N Street North looks like today. Just quickly running through again, because I don't know how to skip through this way. Whoops. So this is what N Street North looks right now. The picture in the middle is still the park activation coordinators who are working in different parks. So it's a park now that is used. It's a safe park. They have programs, they have built-in programs that run during the week and on the weekend. There's a public toilets now that are managed by the park activation coordinators. So the overall lesson, and I think, and Sabina, you had kind of really emphasized this, is that participation is at the core of any development. It invites citizens to voice their needs, solutions, and aspirations. It invited park users to make use of local spaces and to hear about what their actual needs were. It invites invested people to come together to problem solve. It invited the sharing of skills and experiences, negotiations around power, control, and decision-making. And as well, it invites commitment and long-term commitment to the process. So this is a project that started in 2016, and only now have we managed to complete the project as it is with the toilets. So it took 6 years to win the city over, to build public toilets, and also to put in speed humps. It took a really long time. Co-produced and collaborative stakeholder approaches to public space design and management is an effective strategy. If we empower our neighborhoods with responsibility for their own parks, our parks and public spaces will be safe, secure, clean, and relevant. By arming residents with knowledge and a few small tools, the park has never been more active or safer. Apologies. Experimentation is valuable and necessary. There will be failures and challenges on the way, but there will also be successes and opportunities. And we need to be realistic about problem solving. What is critically needed is to find a considered springboard for solving problems which does not reinvent the wheel, but works within existing structures and resources available, including civic resources. And I think that's the end. I just raced through it. And that's Sticky's Facebook page and website.
Great, thank you, Hayley. So we went a bit over time for presentations. So we have maybe how much? 5-6 minutes just to ask one or two questions. If anybody has them, please raise your hands now if you have any questions, and try to keep them as short and concise as possible. While I wait to see if anybody has their hands up, I also just want to assure everyone that the email addresses of the speakers are in the chat if you have any questions. And if you have any comments, SaferSpaces does have a comment section. So after the video is uploaded on SaferSpaces, please feel free to comment. Otherwise, we have 5 minutes. So if anybody does have 1, 2, possibly 3 questions, please do raise your hands now. Oh, I haven't checked if there's any questions in the chat. Okay, there should be a reaction button which will allow you to raise your hand, Matlakala. But since nobody's raising their hands, if you do have a question, please just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Hi.
Oh, Matlakala, I can't. You're very soft, but
Hi.
John, go.
Let me connect my headset.
Sorry, what's going on now?
Okay, hold on, Matlakala. I think while you sort your headset out, let's give chance to John to ask the question.
Very briefly, three great presentations. Thank you. I just want to follow up on the last one specifically, which has done such wonderful work. But then there's the continuation of it. And I think these parks offices are a good start. But I would like to suggest from our experience that it goes from the fact that local government is incredibly important in all these matters, in affecting the quality of life of local people. And it's part of their responsibility also is to provide the kind of supervision, maintenance, and connection with communities. And in our experience, learning from Amsterdam, what has been, until it didn't go on because of a lack of support from the management, but what was really working very well is having a local law enforcement person specifically chosen because of his or her attitude as that on-the-spot connection person between a specific neighborhood and the city council. Connecting with the neighborhood, connecting with all the various wet parks, with roads, etc., etc. And it's a key, it seems to us to be an absolutely key element in maintaining the local facilities that have been brought in, or the local housing, and at the same time connecting with, listening to community and channeling to the city and back again. So that's the point I wanted to make. There's a role for law enforcement, but not doing the enforcing, doing the facilitating. And we've experienced that, and we've seen it at work here and in Amsterdam and in Toronto. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Matlakala, are you ready for your question? If not, then I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. You have a question about Shebeens. Jeremy?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to type it in. I've got a question for Mercy, please. So, Mercy, in your before and after maps of study sites, it seemed to show, and I apologize if I misread it, but it seemed to show that there were 2 Shebeens before and 3 Shebeens after, which doesn't appear after the upgrading, which doesn't appear to be a huge difference in the number of Shebeens. So presumably, it's not that Shebeens were opened as much as that after the upgrading, there was more crime associated with Shebeens than before. And so my question is about not so much about the community side of controlling, let's call it crime, but the formal policing. Do you have any evidence? And I apologize if you presented this. Do you have any evidence on the presence of police around Shebeens before and after upgrading? I mean, I'm familiar with a long tradition of literature which shows that the police tend to avoid Shebeens under all circumstances, but one would imagine that it would be much harder for them to avoid policing Shebeens after upgrading than before upgrading. So do you have any evidence on police presence? Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Jeremy, for your question. So that particular slide refers to Freedom Park in Mitchell's Plain. So when we did the community mapping, yeah, we were told that before the upgrading, they were very strict. The community enforcement of Shebeens was very strict. We had, this particular story of how this lady who tried to open the Shebeen was basically asked to either close her Shebeen or leave the informal settlement. But this kind of informal social control was much more relaxed after this upgrading, and it was related to this lack of cohesion that sort of was prevalent after this upgrading intervention. In terms of the police presence, we spoke to the police, we also spoke to residents, and before upgrading, police really didn't feel safe to go into the settlement. Also, it was difficult to patrol because of a lack of streets and the narrow pathways in the informal settlement, also lack of numbers on structures, for example, really hampered police patrols in the settlement. So there was this sense that this, the physical condition of the settlement really made it difficult for police to patrol. And that's why the community set up their own informal strategies of patrolling, neighborhood watch, their marshal system and so forth, in order to provide safety in the absence of police presence before upgrading.
Thank you.
I
Does
don't know
anyone
if that answers.
Yeah, sorry, but we've run out of time. So if any of the speakers do want to take a little bit of time to respond to John's question, please do so now.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. Can you hear me now?
Oh, Madlakala, but unfortunately the time for questions is past now. So it's just about responses now.
Okay. Right.
Sorry, but please do email the speakers your question if you have one.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Thank
Back
you.
to the speakers.
Sorry, Lauren, were you saying to me?
Yes, please.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, John, so much for your input.
Oh, somebody's unmuted. Please mute yourself, Matlakala, I think.
Just to say to John, we have been in touch. We were in touch with a couple of people at Hillbrow Police Station, but unfortunately, law enforcement is notoriously corrupt here. So that wasn't really an option for us. But we did work a lot with the Joburg City Parks and Zoos and local government and the local ward councillors. So it was a broad-based collaborative process. It didn't include many people from law enforcement, though. But thank you for that.
Great. Thanks, Elia. I hope everyone's questions have been answered to their fulfillment. I'm really sorry that we can't have more time because this is such an intensely interesting topic, and you can see by how many people we have on the webinar that there's a lot of interest around it. So please do contact the speakers or put your comments on SaferSpaces. Otherwise, I'd really just like to thank the speakers for absolutely wonderful presentations and really informative. And thank you for everybody for joining us today. Otherwise, I think I'm going to end the session here. So yes, hopefully the conversation will continue in comment sections and email chat boxes and on SaferSpaces as well. So thank you everybody for joining. Signing off now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, madam.
Itu di ciku cek online dan ciku